Elgin, Middlesex, London.
And thank you very much, Madam Speaker. Today is a very important debate that we're having, and I'm so glad to be part of it. This motion for today calls on the House to condemn the decision of the Parole Board of Canada that resulted in the tragic death of Marlène Lévesque in Quebec City. So today's motion is extremely relevant, especially when we recognize the importance of eradicating and ending violence against women. To me, the correct an accurate decision by the Parole Board, making sure that they're doing their job appropriately. That is what we need to do here today. And I know that today's conversation, I've heard some of the interventions, and we have to look at what actually happened to this woman, what actually resulted in her death, why is the question this happened. It's not so much about the other issues. We can talk a lot about the debates that we've seen sparked in the last week. We can talk about legalization of prostitution, when we look at mandatory sentences, or we can also look at the fact that the federal government has over 200 vacancies on their appointments. There's so many other issues that we can intervene on this, but I think we have to go ultimately to what the issue is, and that is that a convicted felon was released on day parole. So looking at the history of this file, I think is very, very important because we have to put it into its context. What actually happened here, and why is this motion so important today to discuss? To begin, we have to look at the 2006 brutal death at the hands of Eustacio Galaz, who was convicted of murdering his wife with a hammer and stabbing her several times. We need to look at that. What constituted that, and why was this man convicted in the first place? Mr. Galaz was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for 15 years. Then looking at this timeline, we can come to September of 2019, where the Parole Board reviewed his file. His file indicated that he had a history of violence against women even before his murder to conviction in 2006. And according to the documents of the Parole Board, noted that he was not ready to have relationships with women. So as I said, this is such an important thing. His file noted in September of 2019 that he was not ready to have relationships with women. Yet what's going further, and as I continue with this story, that is exactly what happened. So this is a very much a disconnect. We're talking about the violence against women. We're talking about a man's rights to, having day parole or parole, what it may be, but 15 years after the fact. So like any other Canadian who may not be a lawyer or wants to understand the legal background of this, I wanted to put out some clarification, because I think when you look at what are we trying to justify, this is what we need to look at. And we really need to look at the Parole Board of Canada and what is day parole and how do they come up to this decision. So taking directly from the text of the Parole Board of Canada, I would like to read into the answer this. Day parole allows any offender to participate in community-based activities in preparation for full parole or statutory release. Offenders on day parole must return nightly to their community-based residential facility or a halfway house unless authorized by the Parole Board of Canada. In addition to standard conditions of day parole, the Parole Board may also impose special conditions that an offender must abide to during his release. The decision-making process includes two key principles here, and I think this is the one thing that this is what we're debating here today. There are two key principles that seem to have been thrown to the wind when this decision was made to allow this person to have day parole. First, that the protection of society be the paramount consideration in the determination of any case. And secondly, that the board make the least restrictive determination consistent with the protection of society. And that they must consider so many different things as well. They have to look, is there a risk to letting this person out? Is there a risk to society? Is the release of the offender, will he contribute to society? And there's lots of different things that we here see, but this risk assessments that must be taken by the Parole Board are very, very important. And so these 2 points I would like to talk about and how we need to consider them. An offender's social and criminal history must be looked at. So when I look at this decision by the Parole Board of Canada, in September of 2019, the Parole Board noted that he should not have any relationships with women. In 2006, he murdered his wife with a hammer and by stabbing her. But prior to that, we know that violence against women existed in what he does, this man. And we have to look at progression. Was there any progression with this man at all? Is he going to be released to the community, and is the community going to be safe? So looking back at this file, I think where we sit there and say, check, 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 we'll see question marks all over this place. We know that Mr. Galaz was sentenced to life without parole for 15 years. So in 2006 up to 2015, 15 years without parole. He had murdered his wife is a history of violence. And according to the decision made, the protection of society and the offender will not present any undue risk to society. These are checkboxes that were absolutely not checked. And for somebody to make the decision to let him out on day parole after all of the information that was given is extremely risky for the safety of our society. So although the parole board file seems cut and dry, it seems cut and dry to most Canadians, somehow it got lost in translation when we're dealing with the Parole Board of Canada. To me, this question is absolutely crazy. Why did this happen? And so what happened next when we're looking at this? How did this happen in the first place? And according to an article, this is something that we can play the blame game on here, but I think the most important thing is we don't ever want to see this happen again. And I think as we're having this really important debate, who in this chamber wants to see such a horrific crime ever happen again to any victim? So in Quebec, we know that after some changes made in 2017, that there are only 2 of the 16 parole officers who had any experiences, and that means that they're reappointed. And so we've seen some articles, and I would like to share with you a posting from CBC, and it's talking to the 2 former parole officers, and quoting from them from CBC, 2 former Parole Board of Canada members said Tuesday they tried to warn the Trudeau government in 2017 that changes to the way board members were nominated could lead to inexperienced members making dangerous decisions. And here we are today. Those dangerous decisions were made, and unfortunately, Ms. Levesque is no longer with us. They feared that the very inexperienced may have contributed to the death of Levesque, 22 years old, in a room in Quebec City. And one of David Blackburn, he is a parole officer who had served from 2015 to 2018. He stated, "I never would have put a man who has a violent past, who killed his spouse, among young women who are vulnerable." That is so important here. We're talking about, and I'm listening to people talk about vulnerable women. We're talking about an escort. We're talking about a young woman who is living in working in a massage parlor. We are talking about our most vulnerable women. And so we are not protecting them when we allow people to say, go out there and have sex with them. Don't worry about your criminal background, and let's not worry about the risk, that this was okay. All of this is put into the quote that he continued saying, "It's like putting the wolf in the hen house." And that is exactly what the Parole Board of Canada did by releasing this man. Jean-Claude Boyer, a parole board member from 2012 to 2018, agreed, questioning how Galeza's Correctional Service caseworker or the parole officer would have ever characterized the offender's encounters with sex workers as a risk management strategy. This is what really, really scares me. We have people making this strategy. We have people assessing this. And the fact is, this person, if looking at this risk management, recognizing his past history, should have never been released in the first place. Secondly, should have never been released and advised to go get sex and pay for sex to deal with his sexual urges. This is just absolutely ludicrous. And as a mother of daughters, as a member of parliament who represents so many women and children, I am very concerned with what our society is going to look like if we are going to be so light on this type of stuff. Former parole board member Jean-Claude Boyer was one of the group of ex-members who warned the clerk of the Privy Council and the Prime Minister that losing experienced members could lead to this dangerous decision. And that's, once again, exactly what we saw. I also would like to pass this on because today we know is another monumental day because the bill brought forward by Rona Ambrose was also reintroduced by the Minister of Justice today. This is something that I think is extremely important, and we need to see this important type of legislation go through the House of Commons and maybe perhaps look at some amendments because we know that judges are dealing with this, but what about parole board officers? Have they gone through the proper sexual training to make sure that then when they're releasing these people on bail or releasing these people on parole, day parole, do we know that they're not going to reoffend? Are they aware of what has happened to the victim? And these are things, if we're going to protect our most vulnerable, why are we not doing it? We talk about this all of the time, and we are not doing it. Finally to wrap up, according to a CPA document of the Canadian Police Association, in 2007 they noted, many dangerous offenders admit to having committed a large number of sexual offences for which they were not arrested, an average of 27 offences per offender. This is huge concerning. Madam Speaker, I'm really looking forward to continuing this conversation. We can do more and we must do better. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary of the Government House Leader.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. And I indicated this when I stood up to address the issue, and that is that the system that was designed to protect the public failed in this incident. And I think that all members of the House, all political stripes, would recognize that. And it's very tragic in terms of what's taken place. And we give our condolences to Mrs. Levesque's family and friends. It's important that we not forget and continue to push to ensure that it doesn't happen in the future. One of the things that's been a little bit upsetting in terms of the debate that I've heard thus far is when members of the opposition, particularly the Conservative members, try to give a false impression as if it is this government's fault, and that's the reason why it happened. And they go to the appointment process. Equally, I would point to the member that in order for those individuals to be doing what they're doing, those parole officers, it is the co-chair, the co-vice chair, or the vice chair, and that was a Harper appointment. They cannot manage the files until they have been qualified and received certain training. And that is something that's also...
I've been trying to get the members' attention to let them know that I do have to allow for other questions. The Honourable Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
I'm really not sure if the question was in there because I just heard a lot of talking on that, and I hear what you're saying, or I hear what the member is saying. But let's, quiet please, please listen to us. I am talking about a really serious situation, and I love the heckling coming over from there. But the bottom line is, out of the 16 appointees, only 14 of them know what they're doing, or only 2 of them know what they're doing. Let's be honest. Have they had the sexual training or sexual assault training that they needed? Have they had this training? Because obviously somebody thought it was okay to send a violent criminal out there to go have sex. And I do put that on the shoulders of the people who made that decision. Thank you.
Questions and comments? Questions et commentaires. L'honorable député de Shefford.
The honourable member for Shefford. Madam Speaker, I simply wanted to see whether my colleague would be ready not to jump to any conclusions and to let the committee do its work and make its recommendations.
Member for Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Well, I think it's very, very important that we do have this studied within committee. I think that's exactly what this is exactly what we're asking through this motion. We need to have a group of members representing all of our country at that table today. So at the committee where this will be studied, this gives us an opportunity to look at all sides and not just something that's internal, which we've seen in the past from this government at the 42nd Parliament, the amount of times that things have been taken out and blackened. So I prefer that anything that we do is actually transparent and not just to save the government's reputation. Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Vancouver East.
Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for her comments. As we're engaging in this discussion, we've also been talking about the importance of looking at the overall safety for sex workers as well. And part of the study, I would hope, would actually, in fact, get into that question, and so I'm wondering whether or not the member would actually support that from the Conservative side to ensure that the study of this motion would include looking at and examining the practices that are in place with respect to sex trade workers that are currently law in Canada right now, and the risks to which they're exposed to, and what changes might be necessary in going forward.
For Elgin, Middlesex, London.
Thanks for that question. This goes in 2 parts. First of all, we have to look at the parole board, and that's exactly what this is asking for. I know that the conversation has been taken over regarding sex work. I've read many of these articles. I guess it depends where you sit on this. I cannot support prostitution, and I realize that many members would like to do that, and I recognize that's part of the NDP. The Liberal Youth Caucus has that as well. That's lovely. It's just not the way I was raised, and perhaps I think part of the problem is I know that there's approximately 95% of women who are part of the sex trades that are not there by choice. Thank you.